This experiment definitely changed the way how I think about sourdough baking. I really didn't expect this to happen, and I will show you the results. I can't believe it, seriously. This is amazing. I wouldn't have expected that. Guten Tag, I'm Hendrik, also known as the Bread Code. Today I'm going to show you the effects of the autolysis. That's a fancy word for just mixing flour and water and letting that sit over a longer period of time. This creates a lot of dough strength for free and you have to knead less, simply by waiting. Now, almost every recipe that you find on sourdough does this. They would do a 1 hour autolysis, 2 hours, or sometimes even overnight. And this is what I did. I let this autolyse overnight. Now, what I did is I was working on a whole wheat bread recipe. After weeks of testing and a lot of failing, I noticed that the long autolysis actually had negative effects on my whole wheat flour. So my piece of knowledge, which I took for granted, actually had negative impacts in that case. Now, taking that knowledge, I wanted to revert back to my regular dough, which I like to make on a daily basis. Please also check out my full sourdough tutorial, which is really the last recipe you ever need. It covers everything on sourdough baking from start to finish. Which is 300 grams of bread flour and 100 grams of whole wheat flour per loaf. And I really wanted to know what are the consequences. So this one has been autolysed overnight and this one not at all. Over this video, I'm going to be showing you how the autolysed dough behaves next to the non-autolysed one. And this is really interesting because this really visualizes the effects of the autolyse. And overall, I was really impressed with the results. So bear with me, let's have some fun. Let's do some baking action. And now, since this video contains a lot of information and I'm comparing the autolyse versus the non-autolysed dough, I figured I also add chapters to this video. This way you can skip ahead to the chapters that interest you the most, or you can rewatch the video whenever you want, making it very convenient. What really motivates me to keep going with this channel is you. Just like with the last experiments, I figured I asked you, how do you autolyse? And around 1,000 of you answered. And while some of you told me to get lost, I would say the majority autolyses for roughly an hour. So yeah, I'm very excited to see who's right. This is my typical technique. I'm going to be using 300 grams of bread flour and 100 grams of whole wheat flour. In this case, I'm opting for 80% hydration. That's going to be 320 grams of water. And now all I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be stirring this for roughly a minute, making sure that the dough is nicely homogenized. I don't want to create any dough strength. I will just be letting this sit overnight at room temperature. And right now the temperature in my kitchen is roughly 22 degrees Celsius. So this is the normal method that I always do. And right now the dough can still be torn like this. You see there's not a lot of dough strength. But tomorrow morning this is going to be a completely different story. Just removing some of the flour here from the edges. Being a little bit of a stingy German, I don't want to let any flour go to waste. So just trying to clean this up a little bit. Going to clean my hands a little bit, but I'm going to be putting on the lid now, and then this will be sitting at night, overnight at room temperature. And let's have a look at this in the morning. Good morning. And here's our dough. Let's have a look. You see that? Great window pane effect. This developed a lot of strength. Now it's time to be adding the sourdough starter and the salt to this one. Then I'll also be setting up the next dough. And I have one problem. I want to make sure that I create enough dough strength. The problem is my hands. Now you might be wondering what's wrong with my hands. The problem is that I'm making two separate doughs and I can't really ensure that I do exactly the same amount of kneading. So one of them is going to have more dough strength than the other. And because I want to make this experiment as clean as possible, I'm going to be opting for using my old kitchen machine to mix the dough. I'll be doing 2 sets of kneading of each 5 minutes. To me, that always works best when using a stand mixer. So do 5 minutes of kneading, wait a little bit, probably around 15 minutes or so, and then do another set of kneading. That really creates an awesome dough. This way I make sure that both the doughs have the same dough strength. Of course, I mean, this dough after the autolyse, you see how much strength this already has simply by waiting. That's what I love about the autolyse. But by using 5 minutes intervals, I should make sure that both of them have roughly the same dough strength. And that's exactly what I want, to have a clean experiment. Just a small random side note. I just made this whole wheat dough here for another video, and I didn't autolyse this. And just have a look at how well this dough also came together. And this also initially gave me the idea, because for this whole wheat dough, the overnight autolyse didn't create as great results as I hoped. So, yep, let's set up our doughs and then let's continue. Now for 400 grams of flour, I'm always using roughly 8 grams of salt. In terms of baker's math, that's 2%. It's always calculated based on the flour. Next up, I'm going to be adding the sourdough starter. That's 80 grams. In terms of baker's math, I like to use roughly 20%. And of course, this is also going to increase the hydration inside of the dough. And that's actually a question many of you asked. To be 100% scientific, I always state 80% hydration. So this dough here has 80%, but now this sourdough starter has some additional water inside. So the hydration is actually increasing a little bit. But in large scale bakeries, this is typically always already included in the base recipe. And so do I. It would be too complicated to measure this hydration and this hydration and then just do the math. So this might be not 100% scientific here, but this is still a good way that works on a larger scale. So I like to do that as well. Whenever you see a recipe from me, I already make sure that when I suggest the hydration, of course you should figure this out on your own, what works for you. But then I already include that in the whole calculation of the recipe. So everything added now, and now this is going to go into my kitchen stand mixer. Is it a stand mixer? Kitchen machine, I guess. For 5 minutes. At the same time, I'm already setting up the other dough. Oh, and just based on how this dough feels, it developed a good gluten network, but it didn't come together as much as I hoped. It still feels overly elastic. So this dough definitely needs to be kneaded a little bit more. Dough number 2 after the first set of kneading. Small side note. I only wanted to knead this one for 5 minutes, but then I realized it still didn't develop any window pane at all. I wasn't able to stretch it. It was just tear. So I had to knead this one for roughly 10 minutes. And now I think it roughly has the same consistency as the other dough. I'm just going to round this up real quick. And then give this a small rest while I am going to be adding the other dough back to the kitchen machine. And just to show you, see how nice and elastic this dough is, and it still holds together. This is almost the kind of consistency that I want, despite this dough featuring roughly 80% hydration. I'm gonna let this now go back to the kitchen machine, and now just 5 minutes inside. One small side note on using the kitchen machine. Especially for a dough which has high hydration, I recommend you that you go for a little bit of a faster setting. You want to have a little bit of the slap and fold technique. So you want to make sure that the hook here, in this case I don't have the best kitchen machine, it's a simple dough hook. That's because this machine is just not made specifically for kneading dough. You want to make sure that this hits the wall, so slapping and folding. It comes at a cost though, because this is creating a lot of heat inside of the dough as well. I'll be measuring that in the end. But yeah, make sure it at some point is able to unstick itself here from the bottom, and go on a high setting just so that it slaps and folds here against the wall. And those are the two doughs after all the kneading. On the left hand side, the one which I autolysed, and on the right hand side, the one which I mixed right away. And now I just wanted to test how they feel like in terms of consistency, whether this one dough feels different than the other. Just making a nice round dough ball out of this, then also out of this one, to see which one is a little bit more elastic. So I'm now just gonna let them sit here for 15 minutes. I'll make a small time lapse so that you can see the difference in terms of elasticity. Just making sure that they're nice and round. And I think this is good. So let's check out which one is more elastic. Very, very, very interesting. This has me all excited. The left-hand dough, that was the one which we autolysed overnight. And the right-hand dough, I just mixed right away. And you can see this dough here is more elastic than this one. This one spread out quite a lot more. Now, what does this mean? The sourdough has an easier time inflating this dough in comparison to this dough. Since this is so elastic, you will have larger pockets of air likely, whereas this here it's not so easy. The crumb is likely not to be as open. Well, at least that's the theory behind it, and I'm really excited to see how this is actually going to turn out. I never did something like this. I typically always just did this overnight autolyse, and yeah, interesting so far to see the different doughs. I'm just going to be rounding this up now. I like to use a dough scraper now in this case, because I don't like to use some dough on the surface. The stingy German in me, pretty much. Dough number 1. And dough number 2. By the way, this only works because I didn't use any flour on the surface. This is because you're dragging the dough over the surface and it's stuck to it, and that way you can create a lot of surface tension by rolling the dough over the surface. This is not needed, but as I said, I just don't want to have things like this happen where I lose some parts of my dough. This is also very interesting. The temperature now of this dough is roughly 23.7, and I'm just checking the ambient temperature. That's around 23. Let me go here. Yeah, 23. And this dough now is warmer, roughly 2 degrees warmer. And this is one thing which I don't like too much about using the kitchen machine. I end up having a dough which is slightly warmer than my environment. And existing subscribers will know that I'll now be extracting a small dough sample. The problem, however, is that this dough, it has more mass than the small sample which I put in here. And so this small sample will cool down faster than this main dough, which means that this sample will rise, let me double think, will rise slower than this dough because this is warmer. And 2 degrees difference in terms of fermentation times is a lot. It can be 3 or 4 hours maybe. And this dough is definitely going to ferment way faster than this dough. So that's a little bit hard when making 2 separate doughs. They might have a different fermentation speed. Now I'm using this sample here, but still it's not going to be 100% accurate because the dough is warmer than the actual room temperature. And coming back to, you have to develop a feeling for the dough. I'll be using those two, but still, I also need to be very careful now. I need to double check how the dough is fermenting and check the size increase of the dough and measure, or not measure, but feel how it feels when I touch the dough. Is it elastic? Is it puffy? And things like that. Those things are contributing now. A good thing to probably do here would have been to take the dough and place it in a container, which I just mark with a line or so. That way that I could see directly inside of the container how much the dough increased in size. However, I don't have a container like that, so this is the way how I have to do it. Oh, and again, have a look. This dough is not flattening out as much as this dough. So, time to extract a small fermentation sample. 40 grams, I'll be using 40 grams each. Now, since the dough is still not really relaxed because we just rounded it up, it's going to be very hard to actually spread out the fermentation sample. So what I like to do is just wait 5 to 15 minutes, and that makes it so much easier. While doing that, I'm going to be rounding up my doughs now, and then they will go into their container where they will bulk ferment. In this case, until this year doubled in size. I'll be finishing a little bit earlier because I know this dough is warmer than the sample, so this sample lags a little bit behind. I'll probably be going for 50 to 75% size increase. And cold Germany, it's likely going to take 10 to 12 hours, I guess. I'm kind of preferring this dough right now. This one is also, you see how it starts to stick to my hands. I mean, it's a wet dough, 80% hydration, but still, this one here, this is my favorite dough so far. Oh yes, even this test here, this one here is just not as elastic. I'm really curious. Now I'm really intrigued to see what's gonna happen with the final breads. I'm also wondering if you can actually taste the difference. Okay, to the containers now. While the dough is now bulk fermenting, I'm going to be applying a stretch and fold whenever I see that the dough flattened out quite a lot. Don't worry too much about it because we create a lot of dough strength anyways. Stretching and folding always comes at a cost. You even out your crumb a little bit, depends of course on what you prefer. However, it also creates additional dough strength. So it depends on what you want really. I would definitely advise you to do at least one, but don't worry too much about doing too many stretch and folds. I'm going to be placing them as close as possible to the main container. Oh, and here I just see I screwed this up a little bit so that they have the same temperature as the other dough. Just a few degrees in change in temperature mean that your dough ferments really a lot faster, so keep them as close together as possible. Roughly 8 hours pass, and the dough on the left-hand side, that's the one which we autolyse, and on the right-hand side, not. And those parts are roughly the same size, and look at this. This dough is way less elastic than this one. I've not been giving this any stretch and fold at all so far, so this has just been sitting like this. And even more interesting to me is almost, remember this sample here from this dough was a little bit warmer at the start even. And this sample here was colder. Now, if I compare the growth of the two samples, left-hand side autolyse, right-hand not, then check this out. It seems like the left-hand dough, okay, it's hard to show like this in this rotation, but the left-hand dough has fermented more than the right-hand dough. So the fermentation on this one seems slower than on this dough. And you can see how much it's spread out. And I'm very curious now to test how the stretching and folding is going to be. I'm just gonna wet my hands, and this is always a great indicator just to see how far you are with your fermentation. Okay, the dough feels relatively puffy already, nicely inflated. I'm just going to be lifting this upwards. It comes out nicely out of the container. Rotate. I'm using the coil fold technique, which is very gentle on the dough. We don't want to be destroying the crumb now. The more you stretch and fold, the more you even out the crumb. And I'm just as careful as possible here. And just based on how the dough feels, I would say this maybe has another 2 hours or so to finish the fermentation. Very elastic already. So interesting. The autolyse one fermented faster despite this one here having a higher temperature at the start. How can this be? Okay. But this dough also already feels elastic, Not as much as this one though. Yeah, that really nice dough as well. But if you compare, this one also looks a little bit more shiny than this one. So yeah, this one is definitely not in the same stage as the other one. Yeah, this is... I'm sorry if I'm overly excited about this. But the autolyse dough, which is also what I learned before, that the autolyse helps to break down the flour, making it easier for your sourdough to enter a crazy munchie mode. This one seems definitely to ferment faster than the right-hand one. So very interesting to see. Let's continue this experiment. I'll just let that sit until my samples roughly doubled in size. I explained before I have to be a little bit careful. I'll aim for another 2 hours now and then check again, do another stretch and fold to see the consistency. And then we will proceed with shaping. Definitely a great experiment because I've always been doing it for a long time, and I'm very curious to see whether this one, which shortens the process by quite a lot, could be better. See for yourself. Now the left-hand sample doubled in size and the right-hand one is really lagging behind. The left-hand one was the one where I autolysed overnight and the right-hand one where I didn't. It seems, as far as I can see, that the fermentation with the autolysed dough is happening way faster than on the non-autolysed version. Very interesting. What I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna be shaping this one first, and I will just let this one ferment for even a little bit longer because I'm not so happy yet with how the dough looks. Probably I'll give this another hour or so. But yeah, let me show you now how I shape this one, and then afterwards I'll be shaping this one. Time to shape the next dough. The size increase is looking much better. Oh, it's always a little bit hard to show from this angle. But still, just looking at this dough, it's not as elastic as the previous one. But maybe that isn't bad. We're gonna figure out. So I will be doing exactly the same thing. Pre-shaping, letting that sit for a little bit, and then do the actual shaping. Wakey wakey my dough. I let both of them proof for 30 minutes at room temperature and then I moved them to the fridge overnight. They have been inside of the fridge for roughly 16 hours. So this dough is relatively cold and will be baked right away. And we will be starting first with the autolysed one as it has a little bit of a head start to the other dough. I added some semolina flour on top. That really makes it very easy. The dough is not going to stick. My oven has been preheated to the maximum because that's going to give me more oven spring right at the start. So let's watch those two beauties bake. Is it only me or is this really satisfying? Maybe I'm a weird person. Et voila, the two final breads. The left-hand one was the one which I autolysed. Good looking ear here. Even some bubbles here on the crust. Great looking bread. The left-hand one was the one which I did not autolyse. Not as much as an ear here. Interesting. Now, this ear I think shouldn't be a factor alone, because of course sometimes if you don't score right, that can easily happen. I'm most interested in terms of oven spring, and I would say this one has a little bit more vertical oven spring. I mean, those weigh exactly the same. And to have a look at the final crumb. So let's cut those open, have a look at the crumb, and then afterwards do a quick taste test. Number one. Beautiful wild crumb here on this bread. This one looks amazing. Let's see if this one can compete. And number two. Oops. Number two, also looking very wild, looking great as well. Interesting. I somehow created a super hole in there. I don't know what happened. Let's check them next to each other. So the right hand one, which I autolysed, has more oven spring. Let's put them next to each other just to compare. Yep. However, with this, I'm never so 100% sure. Am I really 100% shaping them exactly the same way? I mean, I try to do my best, but I'm not the kind of person who shapes 1,000 breads per day. Just looking at the crumb, I mean, there's this one super large pocket of air. Maybe I should have popped it during the shaping, but based on the crumb, I can't say whether there is a clear winner or not. Which is very interesting in general, because when I was making the doughs, I felt that this one was definitely winning. It just felt so much more stable than this dough here on the right-hand side. But now after the bake, yeah, I would say this one is taking the lead because of the nice oven spring, which I don't have here on this one. So yeah, very interesting. One thing though that I can say for sure after doing this, that the autolyse didn't really help the crumb, I would say. So I don't see, except the oven spring, which might be my shaping issue, I don't see a clear winner in terms of the crumb. So I would say the long autolyse doesn't make a more open crumb. This crumb looks equally as good as this one. I'm very curious about the taste of this bread though. Does the autolyse win in terms of taste over the other bread, or are they relatively similar? One thing I need to ignore is here I got a better ear, so I won't have that crispiness on this bread. But yeah, let's try. I'm excited to see if there's a difference in terms of taste. Let's start with the one which I always eat. So this is my default bread, overnight autolyse. Let's give this a shot. Perfect consistency, good crust, wet crumb, good crust from the bottom, slight sour note to it. This to me is definitely the perfect sourdough bread. And now next up, the one which I autolysed. I'm also going to try this area just to give a fair comparison. That's interesting. This is really interesting. So the one which I autolysed has more of a tang to it than the one which I did not autolyse at all. And this also confirms what I observed during the whole bulk fermentation, that this one just was fermenting way faster than this one. And it seems that the autolyse might also have an impact on the final tang, the final sour note of the bread. This one is a slight note more sour than this one. I can't believe it. Seriously, this is amazing. I wouldn't have expected that. Okay, final verdict time. Very, very eye-opening and interesting experiment. This one looks a little bit better in terms of shape. Although that might be my poor shaping, which I did on this bread, so I can't 100% say that this has an impact on it. One thing is for sure, which I noticed, the long autolyse bread definitely ferments faster than the right-hand bread. The autolyse bread here has a more sour taste to it than the non-autolyse bread. So yeah, the longer autolyse seems to break down the flour, making it easier for your sourdough to go into a crazy munchy mode, fermenting your dough. Definitely very interesting. I learned something new. One thing I wanted to say though, in total my bulk fermentation time has been 12 hours in the current cold Germany. So that's one thing that should also be considered, and maybe that would be another cool experiment, just to check the autolyse timings at different temperatures. Because I feel that when you're just making your dough over, let's say 4 or 5 hours while you're living in the tropics, it might be that you have to do an autolyse. So it could be that the slow fermentation due to the cold temperature just does not require an autolyse. Maybe that's the result of this experiment. Definitely more tests should be conducted. I was just surprised to see how different the doughs perform, and also then now the difference in taste. Quite interesting. So thanks a lot for watching. This definitely changed my view on the autolyses. And yeah, very interesting. I learned something new. I hope you also learned something new. Now, I would be very curious to read what your thoughts on this experiment are. Should I have improved my testing setup? If so, how could I have done that? Which awesome future experiments should I do? Please do drop a comment in the comment section. I'm really excited to see what you have to say. And now, this experiment is another step towards creating the perfect whole wheat sourdough bread. And I've been trying, and for my whole wheat sourdough bread, the autolyses definitely had a negative impact. So yeah, interesting. Here on this bread, it has pros and cons, I would say. But on the whole wheat sourdough bread, definitely I wouldn't autolyse. But more on that in the recipe that's upcoming soon. I'm so excited to finally release this because I've been working on it for a month. So this is going to be a really awesome recipe. You all rock. This channel wouldn't be the same without you. Thank you so much. Let me end this by saying, may the gluten be with you and happy baking.